If they find us, we're dead. The words weren't even a whisper. They were just a thought, a cold, sharp thing Hattie Mae Rowan held in her chest. She was crouched so low in the ferns the damp earth was seeping through the knees of her dress, her arms wrapped around two small, trembling bodies. Sarah and Yaimi, her kids, her world. Jaime's breath was hot and fast against her neck, a little bird's heart beating against her own. Sarah's knuckles were bone white where she clutched Hattie's skirt. Out in the dark, a dog barked. Not a friendly bark. It was the sound of a hunter, a sharp, carrying sound that sliced through the night and went straight into Hattie's soul. They were close, so close she could almost smell the stale whiskey on their breath, the acrid smoke from their roll-up cigarettes. Her own heart was a drum, loud enough to give them away. Thump, 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 a traitor in her own ribs. She wished it would stop, just for a second, long enough for them to fade into the trees to become nothing more than shadows. But it wouldn't. The moon, fat and silver, slid out from behind a cloud, and their hiding spot was suddenly bathed in light. They were exposed, naked to the world. And Hattie knew with a certainty that was colder than the ground beneath her, that the Reeves brothers were looking right at them. She couldn't see them, but she could feel their eyes. Hard eyes. Mean eyes. The kind of eyes that had looked her over in town just 2 days ago, making her feel like a piece of meat. They'd been asking questions. Questions about her, about the children. Questions the sheriff had been all too happy to answer. She remembered standing in that saloon, the smell of sawdust and stale beer thick in the air. The sheriff, Amos, a man with a gut that spilled over his belt buckle and a smile that never reached his eyes, had leaned back in his chair. He'd looked at her, at the desperation she knew was written all over her face, and he just smirked. "I ain't risking my men for your mess, Hattie," he'd said. His voice was final, a door slamming shut. "They'll kill us," she'd pleaded, hating the sound of her own voice. "They're after the children." Amos had just shrugged. "The Reeves pay their debts. You don't. That's all this town needs to know." He'd spat a wad of tobacco juice into a nearby spittoon. It hit the brass with a sickening clang, and behind her, she could hear the saloon girls whispering. Hattie Rowan, always bringing trouble. The shame had burned hotter than the sun, but something else had burned too, a cold, hard anger. She hadn't said another word. She just grabbed Jaime's hand, scooped Sarah into her other arm, and walked out. Back to their tiny shack on the edge of town, and she'd started packing. A loaf of bread, a tin of beans, every last bullet for her late husband's rusty pistol. And now, out here in the woods, with the dogs getting closer, that anger was the only thing keeping the fear at bay. She would not beg again. She would not break. "Come on," she whispered, her voice a ghost in the night. "We can't stay here." They moved like wraiths through the pines, their bare feet making no sound on the thick carpet of needles. The air was cold and sharp, filled with the smell of sap and damp earth. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a man's whisper. They hadn't gone more than 100 yards when a figure stepped out from behind a massive oak tree, blocking their path. Hattie froze. Her blood turned to ice. She yanked the children behind her hand instinctively going to the pistol tucked in her waistband. The man was huge, taller than any man she'd ever seen, with shoulders as broad as an ox yoke. A thick, dark beard covered most of his face, catching the moonlight like a spider's web. In one massive hand, he held an axe. It wasn't raised. It was just there, hanging by his side like it was a part of his arm. He didn't move. He just stood there, a mountain of a man carved from the night itself. Jaime let out a tiny gasp, a sound no louder than a twig snapping, but the man heard it. His head turned, slowly, deliberately, and his eyes found theirs. They weren't mean eyes like the Reeves brothers. They were something else, something wild and ancient, the eyes of a predator. Hattie's mind raced, filled with all the stories she'd ever heard about the man who lived in these woods. Thomas McGraw, Bear they called him. They said he'd killed a man with his bare hands, that he'd wrestled a grizzly and won, that he shot first and never bothered to ask questions later. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic prisoner trying to escape. This was it. This was how it ended. Out of the frying pan and into the fire. But the man didn't move. He didn't raise his axe. Instead, he did something that shocked her to her very core. He crouched down, slowly, deliberately, until his eyes were level with Jaime's. He looked at the boy, then at Sarah, his gaze lingering on their tear-streaked faces and bare, muddy feet. A flicker of something crossed his face. Pity? Hattie couldn't be sure. "You're a long way from town," he said. His voice was a low rumble, rough and gravelly, like stones grinding together. It was a voice that hadn't been used in a long, long time. Hattie found her own voice, though it was thin and brittle. "We're just passing through." The lie tasted like ash in her mouth. His eyes flicked back to hers. They were sharp. They saw too much. "Running, you mean?" It wasn't a question. He knew. He reached into a leather pouch at his belt and pulled out a strip of dried meat. He held it out to Jaime. The boy looked at Hattie, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hunger. Hattie hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to grab the children and disappear back into the darkness. But Jaime's stomach had been empty for 2 days. The hunger in his eyes was a physical thing, a pain she felt in her own gut. She gave a single jerky nod. Jaime snatched the jerky and tore into it like a starving wolf. The man bear watched him for a long moment. Then he looked back at Hattie. "The Reeves brothers are out tonight," he said, his voice flat. "Heard their dogs about an hour ago. They're sweeping the valley." Hattie's breath caught in her throat. How did he know? How did he know who she was running from? "We can manage," she said too quickly. He just looked at her, his expression unreadable in the shifting moonlight. "No," he said, the word blunt and final. "You can't. Not alone. They know these woods. They'll have you by sunup." He stood up, towering over her, a dark silhouette against the stars. "I have a cabin, not far. You can hide there till morning." Her first instinct was to say no, to trust no one. She had trusted men before, and it had brought her nothing but heartache and a husband in an early grave. But then she looked at Sarah, whose lips were turning blue with cold. She looked at Jaime, who was still gnawing on the piece of jerky as if it were the most precious thing in the world. This wasn't about her pride. It was about their survival. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice tight. "In return?" His mouth twitched, the barest hint of a smile in the thicket of his beard. "Nothing," he said. And for some reason, she believed him. But there was something else in his eyes, a shadow, a hint of a secret he wasn't sharing. She didn't have time to wonder what it was. Sarah's small, cold hand found hers and squeezed. It was a silent plea. "Please, Mama, let's go." "Lead the way," Hattie said, the words feeling heavy and strange on her tongue. As they followed the giant of a man into the deeper darkness, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just made a deal with the devil. Or maybe, just maybe, an angel. She had no way of knowing which, and she was terrified to find out. The cabin was small, rough-hewn, and smelled of pine smoke and something wild. But it was warm. Bear lit a fire in the stone hearth, and the flames leaped to life, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. The children, exhausted beyond words, collapsed onto a bearskin rug near the fire. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Sarah laid her head on Hattie's lap and closed her eyes. Hattie busied herself, trying to ignore the silent, watchful presence of the man in the corner. She tended to Sarah's feet, cleaning the cuts and blisters with water from a bucket and smoothing on a salve that Bear produced from a wooden chest. It smelled of herbs and pine sap. He watched her every move, his expression unreadable. When she glanced up, his eyes met hers for a fraction of a second before he looked away, stood, and hefted his axe. He went outside and began to split wood. The steady, rhythmic thud of the axe against the logs was a strange sort of comfort. It was a sound of purpose, of strength, a sound that said, "I am here. I am solid. I will not break." Later, when the children were fast asleep, their faces peaceful in the firelight, Hattie stepped out onto the small porch. The night was cold and clear, the stars scattered across the black sky like spilled diamonds. Bear was sitting on the steps, a knife in his hand, whittling a piece of wood into the shape of a small bird. He didn't look up as she approached. You don't have to keep watch, she said, her voice soft. He didn't pause in his carving. Yes, he said, his voice a low rumble. I do. There was a finality in his tone that sent a shiver down her spine. It wasn't just about the Reeves brothers. It was something more, something deeper. She wanted to ask what he meant, to press him for the secret she saw hiding in his eyes. But the night was too still, the silence too fragile. So she just stood there, watching him work. The only sounds the whisper of the wind in the pines and the soft scrape of his knife against the wood. Dawn came thin and gray, painting the world in shades of ash. Hattie awoke with a start, her heart pounding. It wasn't a sound that had woken her. It was a feeling, a prickling on the back of her neck, a sense of being watched. She sat up, her eyes immediately finding Bear. He was already on his feet, his axe in his hand, his body tense. He put a finger to his lips, motioning for her to be silent. And then she heard it, the soft crunch of boots on snow, the jingle of a bridle, hoofbeats. They were here. She crept to the window, peering through a crack in the rough wooden shutters. Her blood ran cold. Two men on horseback, rifles held across their laps. The Reeves brothers. They were scanning the tree line, their faces grim and determined. They were so close she could see the frost on their beards. Sarah whimpered in her sleep, and Hattie's hand flew to the girl's mouth, smothering the sound. Her own heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, so loud she was sure they would hear it. The men sat on their horses for what felt like an eternity, their eyes sweeping the hollow, passing right over the small, hidden cabin. Hattie held her breath, praying to a god she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. Please, she thought, please don't let them see us. Please. Then one of the brothers said something to the other, shrugged, and turned his horse. They rode on, their figures shrinking between the trees until they were gone. Hattie let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Her legs felt weak, and she leaned against the wall for support. Bear lowered his axe, but his body was still coiled like a spring. They'll be back, he said, his voice grim. They're circling, making sure they didn't miss anything. Then we'll go deeper into the woods, Hattie said, her voice shaking slightly. We'll hide. Bear shook his head. You won't make it. They know these trails. They grew up hunting these mountains. They'll track you down before noon. He turned to face her, his eyes dark and serious. There's only one way. We have to go north, over the pass. They won't follow us into the high country. Not in this weather. The thought of more running, of more cold, of dragging her children through the snow-choked mountains made Hattie's stomach turn. But she knew he was right. They were trapped. Why? She asked, the question bursting out of her before she could stop it. Why are you helping us? He didn't answer right away. His gaze went to the sleeping children, curled together on the rug like two small animals. A strange, unreadable emotion flickered across his face. When he looked back at her, the shadow in his eyes was deeper than ever. Because someone should, he said at last. It was the same thing he'd said before, but this time it felt different. It felt like an incomplete answer, a piece of a much larger story, but she had no choice but to trust him. She nodded, her throat tight, and went to wake the children. As she gathered their meager belongings, a sense of dread settled over her. They were leaving the one place that had offered them a shred of safety and walking willingly into a frozen wilderness. And they were doing it with a man she barely knew, a man with secrets of his own. Outside, the air was sharp and cold. Bear was waiting, his axe strapped to his back, a long rifle slung over his shoulder. He looked like something out of a legend, a wild man of the mountains, dangerous, unpredictable. But as he looked at her and the children, his expression softened just a little. Ready? He asked. She nodded, though she was anything but. As they stepped out of the hollow and into the trees, the smoke from the cabin's chimney curled up into the gray sky behind them. A silent farewell. The forest swallowed them whole, and the hunt began again. The world was a sea of white and gray. Snow-laden pines stood like silent sentinels, their branches heavy with the weight of the storm. The wind howled through the passes, a mournful, lonely sound that seemed to seep into their very bones. Every step was a struggle. The snow was deep, and the cold was a physical thing, a clawing beast that tore at their clothes and bit at their exposed skin. Jaime, his small face pinched and pale, stumbled and fell for the 10th time. Hattie rushed to his side, pulling him to his feet, her own body aching with fatigue. "I can't, Mama," he whimpered, his teeth chattering. "I'm too cold." "I know, baby," she whispered, her own voice cracking. "I know. Just a little further." But she didn't know. She didn't know if they could go any further. The mountains stretched out before them, an endless, unforgiving wilderness. They were just tiny, insignificant specks in a vast, indifferent landscape. Bear, who had been scouting ahead, came back, his face grim. "The pass is blocked," he said, his voice low against the wind. "Avalanche. We can't get through." Despair, cold and sharp, pierced Hattie's heart. Trapped. They were trapped. The Reeves brothers were behind them, and a wall of snow and rock was in front of them. There was nowhere to go. She sank to her knees, pulling the children close, her body racked with silent, helpless sobs. This was it. This was the end of the road. Bear watched them, his face a mask of stone. He looked up at the towering peaks, at the swirling snow, at the gray, unforgiving sky. And then he did something strange. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, intricately carved wooden bird, the same one she'd seen him whittling at the cabin. He held it in his palm for a long moment, his thumb stroking the smooth wood. Then he looked at Jaime. "My boy," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. He loved birds. He crouched down in front of them, the wind whipping his long hair around his face. "The men you're running from," he said, his eyes locking with Hattie's, "the Reeves brothers. They're the ones who took him from me." The world seemed to stop. The wind died down. The only sound was the frantic beating of Hattie's own heart. "What?" she whispered. "It was 5 years ago," he said, his voice a low, painful rasp. "My wife, my boy. We had a small homestead on the other side of this mountain. The Reeves, they wanted the land, said it was theirs. They came in the night, burned our cabin to the ground." He closed his eyes, his face contorted in a mask of agony. "I was out hunting. When I got back, there was nothing left, just ashes." The secret in his eyes, the shadow, it was grief, a grief so profound, so all-consuming, that it had hollowed him out, leaving nothing but a shell of a man. "They think I'm dead," he continued, his voice barely a whisper. "I let them. I came to these mountains to disappear, to wait." "Wait for what?" Hattie breathed, though she already knew the answer. His eyes opened, and they were filled with a fire that was more terrifying than the winter storm. "For revenge," he said. And in that moment, Hattie understood everything. He wasn't helping them out of kindness. He wasn't some guardian angel of the mountains. He was a man with a death wish, and he saw in her children, a chance to fulfill it. He was using them. They were bait. A new kind of fear, colder and sharper than any she had felt before, seized her. She was caught in the middle of a war she didn't understand, a pawn in a game of revenge that had started long before she had ever set foot in these mountains. She looked at Bear, at the raw, naked pain in his eyes, and she saw not a savior, but a man who was just as lost and desperate as she was. And she knew, with a sickening certainty, that he would sacrifice them all to get what he wanted. "There's another way," he said, his voice suddenly hard and businesslike. "A hunter's trail. It's dangerous, but it will take us around the avalanche and down into the lower valley. The Reeves won't expect it. They think we're trapped up here." He stood up, his eyes scanning the treacherous, snow-covered cliffs. "We move now, before the storm gets worse." Hattie looked at her children, their small faces blue with cold, their eyes wide with fear. She looked at the man who was their only hope of survival, a man consumed by a thirst for vengeance. And she knew that she had no choice but to follow him, to walk willingly into the heart of the storm, into a trap that was slowly, inexorably closing around them. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with peril, but the path behind led to certain death. So she got to her feet, pulled her children close, and followed the broken man into the blizzard, praying that his quest for revenge wouldn't be the death of them all. The hunter's trail was little more than a goat path, a narrow, treacherous ledge carved into the side of the mountain. To their right, a sheer wall of rock and ice rose up into the swirling snow. To their left, a dizzying drop into a sea of white. The wind tore at them, a physical force that threatened to rip them from their precarious footing and hurl them into the abyss. Every step was an agony. Hattie's lungs burned with the effort of breathing the thin, icy air. Her muscles screamed in protest. She held Sarah's hand in a death grip, her heart pounding with every gust of wind. Jaime, too small to manage the treacherous path on his own, was strapped to Bear's back, a small, silent bundle wrapped in a bearskin. They moved in silence, a grim, determined procession against the fury of the storm. Hours passed in a blur of snow and wind and pain. Hattie lost all track of time. Her world had shrunk to the few feet of icy path in front of her, to the small, cold hand in hers, to the broad, steady back of the man in front of them. And then, through a break in the swirling snow, she saw it, a dark shape against the white, a cave, a small, dark opening in the rock face, sheltered from the wind. Hope, a fragile, fluttering thing, flickered to life in her chest. Bear had seen it too. He motioned for them to follow, and they scrambled the last few feet to the relative safety of the shelter. Inside, the cave was small and dark, but it was out of the wind. Bear shrugged Jaime off his back and set about building a small, smokeless fire from a bundle of dry tinder he carried in his pack. The small flame pushed back the darkness, casting a warm, golden glow on their exhausted faces. Hattie sank to the floor, pulling the children into her arms, her body trembling with a mixture of cold and relief. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, they were safe, or so she thought. As the warmth of the fire began to seep into her frozen limbs, Bear turned to her, his face grim in the firelight. "They're coming," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Who?" Hattie asked, her heart sinking. "The Reeves?" He shook his head. "Worse." He pulled something from his pack, a piece of paper folded and worn. He handed it to her. It was a wanted poster. Her own face, sketched in charcoal, stared back at her. But it wasn't the crude drawing that made her blood run cold. It was the words underneath. Wanted, Hattie Mae Rowan, for the crime of kidnapping. Kidnapping, she whispered, the word feeling alien on her tongue. But they're my children. Are they? Bear asked, his eyes boring into hers. And in that moment, the entire world tilted on its axis. The story she had told herself, the story she had told him, it all came crashing down around her. The debt, the escape from town, it was all a lie. Their father, she began, her voice shaking, he wasn't my husband. He was a good man, but he fell in with the wrong people. The Reeves brothers. He owed them money, a lot of money. When he couldn't pay, they killed him. The memory was a raw, open wound. The sound of the gunshot, the smell of blood. They said the children were collateral, she continued, her voice thick with tears. They said Sarah and Jaime belonged to them now, to settle the debt. They were going to sell them, to a work camp in the north. I couldn't let that happen, so I took them. I ran. The truth, stark and terrible, hung in the air between them. She wasn't just a woman on the run from a debt. She was a fugitive, a kidnapper in the eyes of the law. And the Reeves brothers weren't just debt collectors. They were human traffickers. And the sheriff, Amos, he was in on it. He had to be. He had been the one to sign the wanted poster. Bear stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. She expected to see condemnation in his eyes, disgust. But what she saw was something else entirely, a flicker of understanding, of shared pain. They took my son, he said, his voice a low growl, and they tried to take yours. This isn't just about revenge anymore. He stood up, his massive frame filling the small cave. This is about justice. He went to the mouth of the cave and peered out into the swirling snow. The storm is getting worse, he said. It will cover our tracks, but it won't stop them. They have a man with them, a tracker, an Apache scout. He can track a ghost through a blizzard. Hattie's heart, which she thought could not sink any lower, plummeted. Then what do we do? She asked, her voice filled with despair. Bear turned to face her, a grim, determined look on his face. We stop running, he said. We turn and fight." He pointed to a narrow, snow-choked canyon just visible through the mouth of the cave. "There. We make our stand there. It's a natural choke point. They'll have to come at us one at a time." The thought of a fight, of a violent, bloody confrontation, terrified her. But the thought of her children being taken from her, of them being sold into a life of misery and despair, was infinitely worse. The cold, hard anger she had felt in the sheriff's office surged through her again, a fire in her veins. She would not let them have her children. She would die first. She stood up, her small frame straight and unyielding. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, her voice steady and clear. A flicker of something that might have been admiration crossed Bear's face. "Keep the children safe," he said, "and pray." He checked his rifle, the metallic click of the bolt echoing in the small cave. "They'll be here by morning." The night was long and filled with the howling of the wind and the pounding of Hattie's own heart. She held her children close, their warm bodies a comfort in the cold, dark cave. She told them stories, stories of brave knights and beautiful princesses, of a world where good always triumphed over evil. She didn't know if she believed in those stories anymore, but she needed her children to. She needed them to have hope. As the first faint light of dawn crept into the sky, the wind died down. An eerie, unnatural silence fell over the mountains. It was the calm before the storm. Bear was already at the mouth of the cave, his rifle at the ready, his eyes scanning the snow-covered landscape. Hattie joined him, her husband's old pistol clutched in her hand. It felt heavy and cold, a piece of a life that seemed a million miles away. And then she saw them, 4 figures on horseback, dark against the white snow, moving slowly, deliberately up the canyon towards them. The Reeves brothers, the sheriff, and the Apache tracker. They were coming, and there was nowhere left to run. This was it, the end of the line, the final desperate stand. And as she raised the pistol, her hands steady, a strange sense of calm settled over her. She was no longer a victim. She was a mother protecting her young, and she would be a force to be reckoned with. The canyon was a tomb of white and silence. The 4 horsemen moved slowly, their dark forms stark against the snow. The Apache tracker was in the lead, his eyes scanning the ground, missing nothing. He pointed a gloved finger towards the narrow choke point where Bear and Hattie lay in wait. They had been seen. Bear didn't waste a second. He raised his rifle, took aim, and fired. The shot cracked through the silent air, echoing off the canyon walls. The tracker's horse screamed and reared, throwing its rider into the snow. The man lay still, one down. The Reeves brothers and the sheriff scrambled for cover, dismounting and diving behind a cluster of snow-covered boulders. Gunfire erupted, the bullets whining past Hattie's head, chipping shards of rock from their hiding place. She squeezed her eyes shut, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was real. This was happening. "Stay down!" Bear yelled, reloading his rifle with a practiced calm that was both terrifying and reassuring. "They'll try to flank us. Watch the right side." Hattie peered around the edge of their boulder, her pistol clutched in a white-knuckled grip. She could see one of the Reeves brothers, the younger one, trying to scramble up the steep side of the canyon, hoping to get a clear shot down into their position. She raised the pistol, her hands shaking so badly she could barely aim. She thought of Sarah and Jaime, huddled in the back of the cave, their small faces pale with fear, and a wave of cold, clear rage washed over her. She took a deep breath, steadied her hand, and fired. The pistol bucked in her hand, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. The man on the cliffside grunted, clutched his shoulder, and slid back down into the snow, cursing. He was hit, not dead, but out of the fight. "Good shot!" Bear grunted, firing another round that sent the sheriff scrambling for better cover. "You're a natural." But their small victory was short-lived. The older Reeves brother, a hulking brute of a man with a face like a clenched fist, let out a roar of rage. He laid down a withering hail of fire, forcing Bear and Hattie to keep their heads down. And under the cover of the gunfire, the sheriff began to make his way up the opposite side of the canyon. "Hattie!" Bear yelled over the din. "The sheriff! He's trying to get behind us." Hattie risked a glance. Amos was halfway up the cliff, his face red with exertion, his eyes filled with a murderous glint. In a few more seconds, he would be above them. They would be trapped in a deadly crossfire. There was no escape. And then, from the mouth of the cave behind them, came a small voice. "Mama!" It was Jaime. He was standing there, his small face streaked with tears, a strange, small iron key clutched in his hand. "I'm scared! Jaime, get back!" Hattie shrieked, her heart lurching with terror. But the older Reeves brother had seen him, and he had seen the key. A look of pure, avaricious greed crossed his face. "The key!" he bellowed, forgetting all about the firefight. "He has the key. Get the boy." The sheriff, hearing the cry, changed his direction, scrambling sideways across the cliff face towards the cave. He was going for Jaime. He was going for her son. In that moment, something inside Hattie snapped. The fear, the desperation, the rage, it all coalesced into a single white-hot point of pure primal fury. She didn't think. She just acted. She broke cover, scrambling out from behind the boulder, and ran towards the cave, firing the pistol wildly in the sheriff's direction, forcing him to duck for cover. "Get away from my son!" she screamed, her voice a raw, animalistic roar. It was a foolish, reckless move. It left her completely exposed. The older Reeves brother raised his rifle, a cruel, triumphant smile on his face. He had her, dead to rights. Hattie saw the dark muzzle of the gun swing towards her, saw the flash of fire, heard the deafening crack. She braced for the impact, for the searing pain, but it never came. Instead, she heard a grunt and the thud of a heavy body hitting the snow. She looked up. Bear was standing over the Reeves brothers' body, his axe dripping red onto the white snow. He had thrown himself in front of her, taking the bullet meant for her. A dark, spreading stain was blooming on his side, but he was still on his feet. He turned to her, his face pale, his teeth gritted in pain. "The sheriff," he gasped. "Get the children." Hattie didn't hesitate. She scrambled into the cave, scooped Jaime and Sarah into her arms, and pushed them towards a small, dark fissure in the back wall that she hadn't noticed before. "Hide," she commanded, "and do not come out. No matter what you hear. Do you understand? Show me." They nodded, their eyes wide with terror, and disappeared into the darkness. She turned back to the mouth of the cave just as the sheriff, Amos, appeared, his pistol raised, his face a mask of sweaty, triumphant glee. "It's over, Hattie," he sneered. "Give me the key, and I might just let you live." Behind him, Bear staggered, leaning against a boulder for support, his rifle lost in the snow. He was fading fast. It was just her and Amos now, the corrupt, bloated lawman and the desperate fugitive mother. The odds were not in her favor, but Hattie wasn't the same woman who had pleaded for her life in his saloon just a few days ago. She had faced down her fears. She had fought for her children. She had found a strength she never knew she possessed. She raised her pistol, its barrel empty, and stared him down, her eyes blazing with a cold, hard fire. "You'll have to kill me first," and she said, her voice low and steady. He laughed, a cruel, ugly sound. "That can be arranged," he said, and took aim. The world seemed to slow down. Hattie could see the sheriff's finger tightening on the trigger. She could see the glint of malice in his eyes. She could hear the frantic beating of her own heart. This was it, the final moment. And then, from the darkness of the canyon floor, a new voice cut through the air. A voice that was cold, sharp, and deadly. "Drop it, Amos!" The sheriff froze, his eyes widening in disbelief. Hattie's gaze followed his. Standing there, a pistol in each hand, was the Apache tracker. The man Bear had shot. But he wasn't dead, and he wasn't on their side. He was looking at the sheriff with an expression of pure, unadulterated hatred. "You," Amos stammered, "but you work for us." "I work for the Reeves," the tracker corrected, his voice like ice. "Not for you. And they paid me to track a woman and two children. They didn't pay me to be part of a slaughter." He took a step forward, his pistol steady. "I heard what you said about the key, about selling the children. I've seen enough of that in my life." His eyes flicked to Hattie, a flicker of something that looked like respect in their dark depths. "This woman," he said, She fights for her family. You fight for greed. He turned his gaze back to the sheriff. Now I'm going to say it one more time. Drop the gun. Amos, his face a mask of rage and disbelief, hesitated for a fraction of a second too long. The tracker's guns barked once. The sheriff crumpled to the ground, a neat, dark hole in his forehead. The silence that followed was absolute. It was over. It was finally over. Hattie sank to her knees, the empty pistol falling from her numb fingers. The tracker walked over to Bear, who had collapsed in the snow and knelt beside him, examining the wound. He's lost a lot of blood, he said, his voice grim. But he'll live, if we get him out of these mountains. He looked at Hattie. My name is Kyle, and I think it's time we all got the hell out of here. Hattie just nodded, her mind numb with shock and relief. She went to the back of the cave and called to her children. They emerged from the darkness, their small faces tear-streaked but unharmed. They ran to her, burying their faces in her skirt. She held them tight, her body racked with tremors. They were safe. They were all safe. She looked at Jaime's hand. He was still clutching the small iron key, a key that had cost so much blood, a key that had almost gotten them all killed. She had no idea what it opened, but as she looked at the bodies of her enemies, lying still and silent in the snow, she knew one thing for sure. It had opened the door to their freedom. The long, desperate flight was over. A new, uncertain future lay ahead. But for the first time in a very long time, Hattie Mae Rowan felt a flicker of hope. They had survived, and that was all that mattered. The journey back was a blur. Kyle, the Apache tracker, proved to be as skilled a healer as he was a hunter. He patched up Bear's wound, using herbs and poultices from his own pack, and fashioned a crude travois to carry the injured man. Hattie and the children walked beside them, a strange ragtag band of survivors making their way out of the frozen wilderness. They didn't go back to town. Kyle led them to a small hidden encampment of his own people, a place of warmth and safety tucked away in a secret valley. Bear was tended to, his fever breaking after 3 long days. Hattie and the children were given food and warm clothes. For the first time they could breathe. They could rest. During those days of recovery, the story of the key finally came out. Bear, his voice weak but steady, told her everything. The key didn't lead to gold or treasure. It opened a safe deposit box in the bank back in town. A box that belonged to his grandfather. A box that contained the original, notarized deed to the entire valley, along with a signed confession from the Reeves brothers' own grandfather, admitting that he had stolen the land through murder and deceit. The debt Hattie's friend had owed them was a sham. It was all a lie. The Reeves family had been systematically driving people off their land for generations, using fear and intimidation and a corrupt sheriff to build their own private empire. Her friend had stumbled upon the truth, and they had killed him for it. They hadn't been after the children to sell them. They had been after them because they believed Jaime had the key to their ruin. It all clicked into place. The desperation, the ruthlessness. It had never been about a simple debt. It was about power. It was about a legacy of crime and corruption. Cale listened to the story, his face grim. My people were the first to be driven from this valley, and he said, his voice low and hard. The Reeves family has a long and bloody history. A new resolve hardened in Hattie's heart. It wasn't enough to have survived. It wasn't enough to have escaped. She wanted justice. For her friend, for Bear's family, for Cale's people, for every family the Reeves had torn apart. We have to go back, she said, her voice quiet but firm. Bear, propped up on a bed of furs, looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. Hattie, he said, it's too dangerous. They think we're dead, she countered. They think they've won. They won't be expecting us. She looked at Cale. Can you get us into town without being seen? A slow, dangerous smile spread across the tracker's face. I can get you into the devil's own house without being seen, he said. And so, a plan was formed. A desperate, audacious plan. They would not run. They would not hide. They would walk right back into the lion's den. They would take back what had been stolen. A week later, under the cover of a moonless night, a small, shadowy group slipped into the sleeping town. Cale, moving like a ghost, disabled the two deputies on night watch without making a sound. Hattie, her heart pounding, used the key to open the side door of the bank. And Bear, leaning heavily on a crutch, but his eyes burning with a cold fire, stood guard. The vault was old and cold, the air thick with the smell of dust and money. Box 317. Hattie's hands trembled as she inserted the key. It turned with a soft, satisfying click. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a packet of yellowed, brittle documents. The deed, the confession, the proof. They took the documents and slipped back out into the night, melting into the shadows just as the first hint of dawn began to paint the eastern sky. They didn't go far. They went to the church, and as the townspeople began to gather for Sunday service, Hattie Mae Rowan, the fugitive, the kidnapper, the woman they all thought was dead, stood up in the pulpit, and she told them everything. She told them about the lies, the corruption, the murders. She held up the deed and the confession for all to see. The truth, clear and undeniable, echoed through the hallowed hall. The older Reeves brother, sitting in the front pew, his face a mask of arrogant disbelief, made a move for his gun, but he never had a chance. Kyle and a dozen of his warriors, who had been hiding in the choir loft, rose as one, their arrows trained on him. The townspeople, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning rage, turned on the man who had been their master for so long. The reign of the Reeves family was over. Justice, swift and absolute, had finally come to the valley. In the months that followed, the valley was transformed. The stolen land was returned to its rightful owners. Bear, his family's name cleared, became the new sheriff, a man of quiet strength and unshakable integrity. Kyle and his people were given a place of honor in the community they had been driven from so long ago. And Hattie? Hattie found a home. She and Sarah and Jaime moved into the old McGraw homestead with Bear, the cabin rebuilt, the land once again filled with life and laughter. The ghosts of the past had been laid to rest. The future, once a dark and terrifying thing, was now bright with promise. One evening, as the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple, Hattie stood on the porch, watching the children play in the yard. Bear came and stood beside her, his arm resting gently on her shoulders. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. They had been through the fire together. They had faced death and despair, and they had emerged stronger and more whole than before. They were survivors. They were a family, and they were finally truly free. If this story of survival, courage, and the fight for justice moved you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more tales of the unexpected. And let us know in the comments below what you would have done in Hattie's shoes.